thanks again for coming in. We have a couple of guests today. First, Michelle Cordova, who's the founding director of Vision Strategy and Insights, or VSI. It's a multicultural research and strategy firm that specializes in generating actionable insights into the Hispanic, African American, and Asian consumer segments. VSI is unique in providing research and consulting services not only to consumer-facing industries such as healthcare, CPG, financial services, and retail, but also to political, social causes, and nonprofit organizations. Prior to establishing VSI, Michelle managed her own multicultural marketing and consulting firm. Her background is in the television industry, having led the marketing and promotions departments at both Univision and Telemundo in Los Angeles. And in her capacity as a special events producer with Univision, Ms. Cordova also led several Emmy Award-winning local and national television productions. We also have with us Marta Clemente Millares, was a co-founder of one of the first Hispanic agencies in the country, Unimar, back in the early 70s. In that capacity, she blazed trails in research and marketing operations for several of Chicago's leading advertisers. She still remains engaged with the community and consults on all matters related to Spanish language advertising. And full disclosure, she's also my mother. I grew up at that agency, Unimar. So that being said, the topic of the day is the evolution of our language in the United States, our language being Spanish. In the media, in advertising, in the day-to-day reality of multi-general households, in TV versus digital, in how it crosses over into the mainstream and how the mainstream is crossing over into our media and entertainment. So to sort of set the table for the conversation, there's this commercial that's been running for Spectrum Media for probably a couple of months now. There are two millennial actors who are basically walking through everything you can do with Spectrum Mobile. And they use terms like texteando, navegando, cotorreando, binge-watcheando, streameando, enlazando, macheando, ahorrando. So is this good, bad, or ugly from not a language perspective, but from a marketing communications perspective?
You want my opinion?
That's why you're here.
In regards to this, I think if it is appropriate, maybe for a client like a Spectrum is appropriate because they are targeting probably younger people that are used to this language. Maybe some of the terms go too far. Texteando and all that is okay, but some of the others that you mentioned, I don't know, I will have to really look at them, but I don't think it's totally inappropriate.
So what would the Real Academia del Español say?
I want to backtrack. I'm here to defend the Spanish language. I think that's why Marcelino asked me to come. I think our reason of being as marketers in the Hispanic market is the Spanish language. So if you don't preserve and fight for the Spanish language, we don't have a job. And I think we owe it to our people too. It's the dignity and the respect, and what defines most of our people is the language. The only thing that sets us apart is the language. And luckily, it's just one language for everybody, regardless of where we come from. We speak with different accents, but the language is the same. So we have a lot of power because we are, 50 million? I don't know, 60 now maybe? And it's because of the language. The day that we lose the language, we don't have a voice, But the language have changed a lot over the years. I'm old enough to remember when I started, when I moved here, that there were, and the advertising was purely directly to the newly arrived people, that obviously it was pure Spanish language. But the language itself have changed because we have people coming from different countries. So this has been enriching the language. And as, like I mentioned to some of you before, I attended a conference of the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, and they said explicitly that the Spanish language in the United States is a real Spanish language now, because it has the influenced and it has been nurtured by all the immigrants from the different countries. And you know, you don't have to speak like a Spaniard or Argentinian. You can have a language that is common enough and simple enough that a recently arrived in the border now immigrant will understand, and a second generation or maybe even a third generation will understand. But I think our mission has to be to respect the language and see for every brand or client or service or whatever, what is the best use of that language?
But do we run the risk when we're talking to younger, let's say the first generation born U.S. Hispanic, who's growing up maybe, let's say, perfectly bilingually or English preferring, are we running the risk of talking over them? Are we running the risk of not communicating effectively?
Well, I think you have to kind of balance those two things, right? The same way you do in your own household, right? So if your children, you know, a lot of households, we speak Spanish to our children speak English back to us. But we want to make sure that the Spanish that they hear is correct, right? And we want to make sure that if they are speaking Spanish back to us, it's correct, right? So there's that protecting of the language. You know, we see this in English, even that there's, I've noticed in the last couple of years in advertising, people have completely forgotten that it's less sugar but fewer calories. So everything is less calories, which is absolutely grammatically incorrect and not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. But it's literally taken over advertising, and you'll see less all the time when they should be saying fewer. That happens in Spanish too. So we don't want as advertisers to multiply those mistakes. But in terms of Spanglish or Spanish that's spoken on the streets, like, you know, texteando is a perfect example. That's what people say. There isn't, I mean, mandar por text hasn't been said since the day texting happened, right? It was like fax. You know, when we had fax, we did the same thing. It was faxear. No one said, you know, te mando un fax. It just wasn't happening. You know, that's not how people were talking. So there is certain language evolution when there's a lack of a proper word in Spanish. The Japanese use it too, right? There's a lot of technical words that are just English words because it's easier to say. But I agree, there is a line where, you know, mixing, you know, you definitely want to talk the way people are talking on the street, but you don't want it to be inauthentic. You don't want it to be throwing in a Spanish word here, throwing in a Spanish word there to make it seem cool, but that's not how people are actually using the language.
And if we accept the way they talk, and maybe sometimes we talk like that, but they have to see us as teachers maybe, or as, like I say, defenders of the, that they know that there is a correct, not correct is maybe it's not the word, but there is a, that they can learn from us.
The problem is that advertising is not a teaching tool.
No, I'm talking about when we talk with people.
Yeah, but I think we're talking about the language as advertisers and as marketers. I mean, do we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of the language? Or are we interested in communicating and selling?
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think that when you're speaking Spanish, you should speak it correct, right? So if your spot is in Spanish, your spot should be in correct Spanish. You know, we take a lot of shortcuts. I know, you know, we use billones, which isn't a word that really exists, right? It's mil millones. So there's shortcuts that we take because.
Also, we live here. No one will understand mil millones. Decimos 2,000 millones,
right?
I entiende. So we say 2,000.
So that goes to the original question. That's what I mean by going over people's heads. There are a lot of words
correct
that Latinos who have grown up in the United States will not understand.
Right, I'll tell you one, I mean, and you do tend to run into some legal issues too, because of the way people want, you know, in certain industries, they need to say something a specific way, but like primas, right? I mean, that's a technical word for monthly payment that is the right word, but, you know, sometimes it's not the right word to put in an ad.
I completely agree, because that's something that he and I disagree with, because I like to use that, and you use another word that people here use much more.
Quota.
Quotas, mensualidades.
Quota is something else. It's not prima. Quota is a pago en cuota. O sea, that's a monthly payment, but it's not your insurance premium.
Yeah,
correct.
Es prima, sí.
Right, but a lot of people don't understand that. So that's, you know, and that's why sometimes if you're looking to set, like we do a lot of research with companies like,
Right.
you know, like technical companies, or we've done it in the automotive industry, we've done it for baseball, where we actually create glossaries for our clients. So, you know, because some terms, you know, it makes sense to stick to some things that make sense, you
Right.
know, and maybe what makes sense on the West Coast or Chicago doesn't make any sense in Miami or New York.
Right.
So, I mean, I remember that Honda commercial a long time ago where they had everyone talking about the trunk, and they talked about, it was a very long time ago, but they kind of had people from different countries talking about what they called the trunk. They were talking about how big the trunk space was, and that was a great way of kind of,
Huge.
yeah, it was a great way of emphasizing that we all call it different things, but we're still talking about a spacious trunk. So you can do that sometimes and make it funny, but you do have to alter sometimes what you say so that people understand what you're saying.
Which I think was to your point, that the United States Hispanic has sort of amassed all the influences into kind of a more generic Spanish but I think to the loss of the language,
Right.
the beauty of the language.
Right.
Right.
But we have to give credit, for example, a second generation person or a person that maybe doesn't know enough Spanish, or for that matter enough English, that when you're listening, you get the whole thing. Maybe you don't understand a word, but you know what they are trying to say.
Yeah, there's a context.
So let's say that you say that you or a second generation or even third generation hears something, they know. If they know some basic Spanish,
Yes.
you get, for example, if I am with not with a Mexican, because obviously I know a lot of the Mexican lingo, but I don't know, somebody from Peru that I'm not that familiar with, they might say a word, but they don't say a word out of context. They say a word in a whole sentence.
Right.
So you get the meaning. So even a younger person will get the meaning. And if the Spanish is correct, they will understand it. We're not using words that are, you know, Cervantes or from
Right.
the old,
Well-
like I'm reading right now, Jorge Luis Borges' short stories, and half of the words I don't know what they mean, but I get the whole sentence.
So it's kind of a choice. Like you can say parquear because that's what people say, but there's a perfectly reasonable word, estacionar,
Estacionar.
which means the same thing. So it's kind of a choice that you do then, whether, you know, and that's going to depend on if you're, you know, if your target is a younger person, and also just your own personal ability to stretch. Because I would say under no circumstances should you use parquear ever, because there's a perfectly serviceable word to use instead
And
I realize
that
that
everybody uses.
that everybody understands.
I realized
I
that
think
when I
that's the
moved
key.
here.
It's not the usage, it's the comprehension.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
So we have, in the mass media world, we have Univision, Telemundo, Azteca America. They're all, let's say that they're sort of defending the Real Academia, because they're all using, mostly, the anchors, I'm talking about the
Right, the
news,
language that's
the
used
news
in the news.
organizations,
Mhm.
right? Not the programming per se.
Correct.
But in the digital world, we don't have that. The digital world is completely fragmented. There are really no arbiters. And that's being driven by younger generations. So what's proper there?
Well, and there's an additional challenge with digital in the character space, right? So it already takes 5 seconds longer to say 15 seconds of worth of content in Spanish, right? It already takes 10 seconds longer to do a 30-second spot. So you're already limited by how long Spanish is, and then there's the character limitations. So you can, and we don't have the kind of shortcuts that in Spanish that we have in English. So it's a lot harder. So I think it takes a very skilled person who not only knows the language very well, but is a skilled copywriter that can really get across what needs to get across in that limited number of characters and that limited amount
And
of
it's worth mentioning that English is kind of under attack by the
Yes.
same demographic because of
Yes.
of everything you're saying.
Right.
You know, at our agency at D2H, I write a lot of copy, and I'm first generation, right? So I probably consider myself 60-40, 55-55 English, Spanish, bilingual. But I recognize that the structure of what I write sometimes is coming from an English language grammatical perspective. I might use the right words.
Right.
Sometimes I might overstep Cuban or Caribbean. But then Patricia, who is, I ask her, please copy chief this. She comes from a more purist perspective. And then we find a balance. right? Because
Yes.
there's always that balance between, it may or may not be perfect in Spanish,
Yes.
but it has to be perfect in what it communicates. I
Absolutely.
mean, the key to your point is to have somebody who writes in Spanish, to a greater or lesser degree, but at least takes on the job or the project or the message in Spanish,
Yes.
from the
And I
get-go.
think it's important maybe to have somebody else double check it, especially like the legal stuff and all that. You have to have somebody that, okay, this is really what it means.
You know, yeah, absolutely, but the legal stuff sometimes is best served in its own language.
Yes.
Which what you said
Yeah,
earlier.
but not only
Because
legal, but since there, for example, insurance and
Yeah, no, I
certain industries that you really have to be careful that you
Right.
don't change the meaning.
Or,
you know?
or the
Right.
pharmaceutical with all
Exactly,
the disclaimers,
exactly.
you
Right.
know, that basically, I don't know if they're I mean, I'm sure they're translatable because they sell them in outside of the United States in Spanish-speaking countries. But I don't know if it's worth
Mm.
translating all of that copy into Spanish to convey the message.
Yes, sometimes it gets very complicated.
Right.
Now, how do we deal with somebody brought up earlier the idea of Spanglish? How do we, so even if you look at Spanglish in New York, Chicago, and Miami is very different from Spanglish in Texas and California. So even the non-pure Spanish, as a matter of degree, is different depending on where you go. So how do you, the digital world probably sorts itself out because people are going to the sites that they're going to go to, and they'll get whatever consistent language. But if we're producing a commercial for network distribution, we can't take into account those local differences. Where's the line? Where's the line in how we?
Well, what I would try to do if there is a word in Spanish for what you're trying to say, don't use the Spanglish. If there is, I cannot think of an example, but the Spanish is so rich that if you find a word that exists, why introduce the Spanglish?
It's not so much that it may exist, but it may not be in use.
Right?
in
No,
that
I
context.
mean that exists and is that everybody will understand.
No,
it.
right.
I
Right.
cannot think of a good example, but of course, if there is, all the new terms, all the technological things and all that, you have almost by default you have to use Spanglish.
Yeah,
because,
I mean, a lot of people say in Spanish, mándalo mi correo. No one says mándamelo por correo electrónico.
Right.
Mándamelo por email.
Right. Right.
Right.
That's fine. For me,
Oh,
that's
mándame
not
un
really.
mail.
For me,
Right.
that's not
Mándame un
really
mail,
Spanish because it's using a word in English that everybody's using. So
Mhm.
that's not really. For me, Spanglish is inventing words like rufero or something like that. There is,
Yeah,
Right.
or
But
troque.
it depends on
la
right,
troca,
la troca,
or
right.
la carpeta, whatever.
Right, but that
You
ends up
know.
being a whole different thing because you're talking, you're not even talking about carpet at that
Yeah,
point.
exactly.
But I think from an advertising standpoint, you have to look at your intention. So
Mhm.
if your intention is to reach a bilingual audience,
Mhm.
and to communicate, that you're talking to Hispanic, that you're looking for Hispanic eyeballs, then I think there is actually a good use for Spanish because you don't see a lot of Spanish digitally, and so you can use a word, especially a strong word. I mean, in the civic education and engagement, community will use justicia, right?
Mhm.
You'll use familia. There's certain words that draw the eye, and then even if the rest of the copy is all in English, it says something. Like the word justicia says something much more than just, oh, here's a Spanish word here. It communicates a feeling and a call to action that's shared by a lot of different people, right? So I think in an advertising context, you could certainly use Spanish words.
And it also breaks through the clutter.
Absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
is shocking if you're watching English television and all of a sudden hear a Spanish word.
Right.
Even something as simple and as what become cliche as mija,
Right.
that breaks through. Or in Spanish, all of a sudden you hear in a Spanish commercial, you hear An
An
English
English
word.
word.
Right, we use a lot of English sound bites, you know,
Mhm.
let's say candidates or,
Mhm.
or people speaking, you know, we used, you know, some rally, you know, a rallying cry at one point, or you can hear like the "Si se puede," you know, behind people when they're in a rally. We'll use that sometimes
That's
to
very
break through,
appropriate,
and
very
you know, it's
appropriate.
English, but it kind of breaks through and sets the stage for the rest of the commercial.
So now that TV spots are really becoming video spots, right? Video is replacing TV because of the whole cross-platform omni-channel thing. Now we're starting to see Spanish written a lot more than we used to. Right?
Yes.
So how does that figure in this whole
That's,
context? Because now,
yeah.
if we're not honoring Real Academia Spanish, we're evolving the language and it's being spelled in ways that has never been spelled, it's almost a little bit more a shock to the system than what we hear. So how does that, do you think that's gonna bring us back to a more pure Spanish, or?
Well, it depends on, like, so we have a rule that if you're, like, textear, we would never put, you know, we would just use the English text,
Text.
right? We wouldn't put textear.
Exactly.
So, because, you know, you're reading it, you're gonna read what you're hearing. You know, you're going with the original meaning of what it is. But, you know, that's an individual preference. I would always go back to, if you're going to be using Spanish, use it correctly.
Right. And forget about academia Spanish. It doesn't exist anymore. Not even in Spain.
But you know, there's very common spelling errors and things that obviously you should try to avoid. You know, I always say I don't think an English language advertiser would let a typo go out in an English ad. So why would we?
Right.
You know what, this is going a little off topic, but what I think is there's a marked difference in the East Coast and the West Coast and Texas, in that in the East Coast, particularly Miami, there's no shame or even a sense of pride in speaking Spanish. They open with Spanish. Here, if you open with Spanish, first of all, the eyes go wide and the question marks begin. The Hispanic, I think, has, in the West Coast, right, has a little bit of, it's a little bit reluctant to speak Spanish.
Yes.
I think it has a lot to do with prejudice.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, but,
Mhm.
but what strikes me is that here in Los Angeles, we're the majority.
Right, but
But you
people-
could argue with Puerto Ricans, whether they're in Florida or whether in New York, have been molding the two languages for a long time because of their,
Right, exactly.
just because of their
And they
their
are
political context.
they are all the same, like the Cubans in Miami, so they are like a ghetto.
Right.
Right.
So,
But
I've
that-
been,
yeah, I think that's when kind of advertising environment matters, right? So if you're listening to Spanish radio, you're going to expect a certain amount of Spanish.
Right.
If you're watching Spanish language TV, you're going to expect a certain amount of Spanish. It's the digital environment that's a little bit more challenging. Is, you know, trying to, and again, I think it depends on your intention. If you're trying to grab people's attention, then I would absolutely use, you know, Spanish words. If you're just trying to reach, you know, bilingual or English dominant younger people or people who may not speak that much Spanish, you know, a mija or a, you know, just one or two words
subtle.
in there would make sense, but you know, you don't want to challenge them to speak a language they may not understand.
It all goes back to who is your target. You know? Of course, if you're trying to sell food to the newly, recently arrived mother, you know, with 10 children, whatever, 2, you try to explain them what these products are. I mean, you have to talk in Spanish, simple maybe, no academia, but you have to tell them that there is a soap called this and that, or what cereal called this and that. 20
Right.
cereals, you know, which one do you choose?
And there's certain words that have gone mainstream, like, you know, 10 years ago, who knew what sriracha was, right? And how to spell it, right? But we all figured it
Still.
out.
Not even espresso coffee, you know.
Right, but there are certain words that have now, you know, kind of come into, you were mentioning the Pollo Locos box.
Right.
You know, I think those, you know, there's certain Spanish words that now kind of everyone understands, and that's part of the general vernacular, and wouldn't turn anyone off if they saw it in a digital ad.
Yeah, downstairs, on the street, it's not even in the building, there's a little store, they're Costa Rican, but the name of the store is called Cafecito. And everybody knows it, they just call it Cafecito. And maybe 10 years ago, that would never have happened.
Well, there was no cafecito.
Well, we're out of time. There's probably a lot more that we could talk about this subject, but if anybody who's watching wants to hear more, learn more, we're going to put up our emails at the end of this speedcast, and feel free to write, engage, challenge, and join in the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.